Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to walk through activity 8-5 titled Applying Account Policies to an OU, an organizational unit. This is from the MCSE/MCSA Guide to Microsoft Windows Server 2012 Administration in preparation of exam 70-411. In my edition of the book, this activity begins on page 308. So a quick background before we dive into the full activity. We have done previous activities working with group policy objects and settings for password policies. So currently we have a user account policy that will not remember passwords. There's no limitations to how old or new a password has to be. The only catch is that it does have to meet the complexity requirements. So we have that policy, and we also have a default domain policy with some other settings. So we have a minimum length requirement here, but according to this policy, we no longer need to meet complexity requirements. And so we're going to take a look at how this impacts and affects domain controllers and domain administrators specifically. We could move this policy down into an OU where our users would have their account set up in Active Directory, where their account object would be, and that way it would apply directly to them specifically. Having it at the top of the domain, it should apply to everything, such as the way the default domain policy will kind of ripple effect down to everything below it. So to really test how these are going to interact and what kind of conflicts we may or may not see, we're going to remove this user account policy from the domain, and we're going to bring it down and put it directly on domain controllers. So that way from the domain side, we're getting these settings, but then in the OU, we're getting these settings. Alright, so let's run a GP update. And then once that's completed, we'll close our command prompt window, and we will attempt to change our password. And we get an error that it can't be updated, that it does not meet the length, complexity, or history requirements of the domain. Note that this is the domain administrator account that I'm using. And so if we come back, none of those are requirements determined by this policy except for the complexity requirements. On the flip side, for the domain policies, we only have a limit of 4 characters. It does not have to meet complexity requirements. And let's take a look at one more that's not showing there because it's not configured. Password history, which is 24 passwords. So where we have conflict is the complexity requirements, because our domain policy says it doesn't have to meet. But our domain policy does say I can't use the same password until I've cycled through 24 passwords. Then I could reuse my first one. And so that's actually what's causing that error, is that our domain policy applies to the domain administrator. And therefore, the domain administrator has to cycle through passwords. If we came back down to our user account policy, and we remove the complexity requirements here, and then ran another GP update, and that way we can compare these settings where it's, let me refresh that, there we go, where it's disabled. So now complexity does not matter on either policy. That should be done. Alright, so we no longer have to meet complexity requirements, but that setting that's not showing here is that it will still remember my last 24 passwords, because this policy applies to the domain administrator and domain controllers. So if we try again, I still get the same thing because it doesn't meet the history requirement. So then, on the other side of things, what if we had the history requirement from this policy, but then in the OU, I specified that it no longer has to meet that, it won't remember the last 24. Well, it's already set that way. So the default domain policy is the one that will be applied to my domain administrator. And the OU policy will have absolutely no effect because the policies can only be set at the domain level for domain accounts. So it would have to be set here for domain accounts. And that's why we see this policy linked down in an OU has absolutely no effect on the account policies for this administrator account. Alright, so to finish this, I'm going to go ahead and remove the policy. Ooh, let's make sure I'm on the policy there. There we go. That looks like that covers everything for this activity. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them for me below, and I will try to reply in a timely fashion. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.